So yeah, my name is Eva. This talk is called Safety, Justice, Compassion, Contributing to the Ethical Tech Paradigm Shift. My name is Eva PenzeyMoog. I'm the author of a book called Design for Safety, which came out from A Book Apart in August. I'm the founder of something called the Inclusive Safety Project. Inclusivesafety.com is where you can learn more about that. And I'm a principal designer here at A-Flight working with Nicole. And my pronouns are she and her. Also, quick note that my partner is away from the home and we have a pit bull who he howls along with sirens, and sirens pass like kind of frequently. So if I pause and you hear some like very despondent howling, that's what's going on. Okay, cool. So before we get into like what it means to contribute to the ethical tech paradigm shift and what the paradigm shift even is, I want to ask, what do we actually mean when we say ethical tech? Like, how do we define that? What does it mean in a practical way for us as technologists who aren't, philosophy professors? What does it even mean to be ethical? Because there's so much stuff going on. Sorry, I'm not realizing that these slides are messed up. Sorry. I have a bunch of different things here. There we go. Okay, so there's so much going on. Racist chatbots, sexual harassment, biased algorithms that disproportionately put Black people in prison, technology that is used for domestic violence. Like there's so many different things that are going on in this space that we kind of put in terms of ethical tech. They're all under the same umbrella, but they're all ultimately so different from each other. So basically, I don't really like this term. My issues with it are that it's vague. There's no actual problem defined. And when we don't actually define a problem, we don't actually define solutions. And when we don't define solutions, there's no accountability. And when there's no accountability, it's really hard to make meaningful change. So I think ethical tech is a fine term in some cases. If you're describing, for example, like a college course or some type of class that covers a wide array of all these different tech issues, or if you're just using it as a catch-all term for the multitude of horrible problems in tech right now. But I don't really think it should be used for basically anything else. What we should use instead is something that I do have an answer to that I'm going to get to later in the talk. And it's pretty long and complicated. So before we get to that part, I want to tackle the more simple part of this question, which is what we mean by a paradigm shift. And this is thankfully a little bit more straightforward because there have been a lot of different paradigm shifts throughout history. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my all-time favorite one, which started in 1956. Back then, cars looked like this, pretty swank, but there was one big thing. Well, there's a lot of things, but one really big thing that's missing from this car that we have in all cars today, which is seatbelts. So everyone knows that seatbelts are very important, but the actual statistic around this is that they reduce serious injuries in car crashes by half, which is really big deal. But when they were first introduced in the 1950s, no one really was using them, no one wanted them, and no one really cared that they weren't there. And this is despite the fact that automobile injuries and deaths from crashes were at an all-time high, and this was a really, really big problem. Part of the reason that no one wanted them was because of the additional cost. They were basically an add-on feature, some type of upgrade when you bought a car. And in today's equivalent, they were a couple of $100 extra. Also, quick fun fact, this is what child seats looked like back in the 1950s. You had this seat that you kind of just slung over the front seat. There was an alternative option, which was basically like tying your kid to the seat with this fancy strap thing for $1.88. Or some cars came with these cool little booster seats that you could let them sit with you in the front, again, without any seatbelts. There were basically no rules back then. And clearly, auto safety has come a really, really long way since 1956, when only 2% of customers were purchasing seatbelts for their cars. So let's go forward to 1965. Along comes a young man by the name of Ralph Nader. And you might be thinking, Ralph Nader, that name sounds super familiar. And yes, it is the same Ralph Nader who has run for president many times through the Green Party. I didn't know this before getting really into the history of seatbelts and doing all this research, but he's a really awesome activist, and he basically set the groundwork for modern consumer protection. But back in the mid-60s, he wrote this book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and it was all about how car manufacturers were prioritizing profits over the safety of their users. And that might sound familiar to you because it's exactly what is happening in tech right now. So the book covered a couple different things. First of all, the issue of seatbelts and how just absurd it was that they didn't come standard in cars, but also things like how tire pressure was actually calibrated for comfort over safety. Some cars back then could not even properly bear the weight of a fully loaded vehicle. He also talked about the fact that dashboards often had bright chrome displays that would reflect sunlight directly into the driver's eyes. And there was also a lack of a standard shifting gear pattern. So this meant that when you borrowed a friend's car or drove someone else's, you might think you were putting the car into reverse, but because the shifting pattern was different, you would actually be in drive. And then when you put your foot on the gas, you would go forward instead of backward. So that was a really big problem. Ralph Nader also wrote about the fact that car designers were just allowed to sort of ignore the existing crash science. And there was a decent amount back then, but manufacturers just didn't have to do anything with it. He also talked about the negative impact that cars were having on the environment already at this point. And I know there's at least one person from Los Angeles here, but that's the city he focuses on this book because fog from pollution from cars was already starting to be a really big problem back in the 60s. Ralph Nader criticized automotive company leaders for refusing to prioritize safety over the fear of making cars more expensive. And they also used this term, alienating users. They were very afraid of alienating their users. They didn't want to do that, which also might sound very familiar to some of us today working in tech. He also pointed out how the industry had run marketing campaigns to shift responsibility of safety away from themselves and onto drivers. They also would criticize the design of roads and said that that was part of the issue. But the issue wasn't at all from them. It was all about the roads and mostly about users and users not understanding how to drive safely. They were basically saying like, this isn't our fault. It's not our problem. This is an issue of user education. People just need to learn how to be better drivers. So Nader's big call to action in this book was for the federal government to regulate the automotive industry and force them to do a better job at preventing all of this very preventable harm. This book became a bestseller, and what followed afterwards was one of the most successful public health campaigns of all time. Nader's investigation contributed to the growing public outrage about how car companies had this sort of like very dangerous and deadly for their users. And all of this together led to the government finally taking action, and Congress created the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is responsible for things like reducing automobile death and injury, promoting the use of seatbelts, child seats, and airbags, helping states reduce drunk driving, setting and enforcing safety standards, and investigating safety defects in automobiles. And this is all, this like part of our government still exists. They're still doing this work. So let's move on to 1968. It's been 3 years since Ralph Nader's expose came out, and 12 years since seatbelts first became available and no one was using them. It's in this year that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration creates a law that all vehicles, except for buses, have to be fitted with seatbelts as a standard feature and not something that people buying cars have to pay as an extra thing. So this was a really, really huge victory. And to some people, it might seem like this is where the story should end, but it doesn't. A lot of people were still just really against seatbelts, in large part because of the supposed inconvenience. There were also some sort of physical medical things that people were worried about. People thought that it would trap you in your car if you, for some reason, drove into a lake, which I think people thought was way more common than was actually happening. A lot of people also genuinely thought that it would do internal damage to your organs when it prevented you from flying out of the car, and that was worse, and that it was actually safer to be sort of flung away from a car crash than it would be to be confined to the car with a seatbelt. And this is despite the fact that scientists and doctors had done a lot of research, and none of these things were actually a real concern. But even back then, a lot of people were choosing to not follow science and medicine. And of course, there was no law saying that people actually had to use seatbelts. The law was just that car companies couldn't charge extra for them, and they had to come standard. But there were a lot of people responding to seatbelts back then, the way that some people are responding to masks today, claiming there's some kind of incredibly awful thing whose mild inconveniences far outweigh their life-saving benefits, or that they're actually somehow dangerous. I find it both kind of sad, but also kind of reassuring to know that this type of thing has actually been going on for decades. So by 1983, not that much had changed. Less than 15% of Americans reported consistently using seatbelts. New York State decided that they wanted to do something about this. So in 1984, they passed the country's first law that required people to wear seatbelts. Auto fatalities drastically decreased in New York, and then the rest of the states passed their own seatbelt laws throughout the 80s and 90s, almost. There is all states require that children wear seatbelts, but there is actually one state where adults are still not required to buckle up. And I'm curious if anyone happens to know what state that is. I can't see the chat, so if you know the answer to this, you can take yourself off mute. Does anyone know where you legally, as an adult, still don't have to wear a seatbelt? No? Okay, I'll tell you the answer. It's New Hampshire. They are staying very true to their live free or die motto. And in this case, it's really sad because a higher percentage of people there do die in auto crashes because they're not wearing their seatbelts. A fair amount of people in New Hampshire do actually choose to not wear their seatbelts. But even with New Hampshire aside, every state did drastically increase their percentage of seatbelt use over the next few decades after the seatbelt laws passed in the 80s and 90s, with the result that in 2019, the national use rate for seatbelts was just over 90%. So this is the point where I think we can say that the paradigm shift has happened. Car manufacturers in 1956 were charging extra for seatbelts and declining to self-regulate, only 2% of people actually buying them, probably not even all of those 2% using them, to now when over 90% of people use them, the government forces the auto industry to take all sorts of measures to try to make them as safe as possible. And the majority of people just wear a seatbelt, and it's not even something we think about. So just to recap really quickly, seatbelts were introduced in 1956, and activism around them started in 1965. 1997 is the year that the last state passed a seatbelt law, and that kind of marks the end of the big legal paradigm shift. And then the cultural paradigm shift, I think, happened a bit longer, with kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s with seatbelts as the norm, becoming today's young and sort of young middle age, I guess, adults who wear seatbelts without thinking about it. And I know that I can remember pressuring my grandparents to use seatbelts when I was a kid. So there was a lot of outward effect from this generation as well on other generations. But all told, that's 3 decades of activists, academics, regular people, and eventually politicians working together to create this paradigm shift where seatbelts are the norm. So what does this have to do with us as people who work in tech? I'm sure that a lot of you have drawn some connections between the auto industry pre-1968 and the tech industry today. And I want to draw some specific parallels between the two in our quest to sort of understand more about the ethical tech paradigm shift and where we're at in it now, so that we can then understand how to best contribute to it. So in both instances, we have a massively powerful industry choosing to prioritize profits over the safety of their users. With the automotive industry, eventually public outrage and activism led to the government creating regulations and forcing them to comply with them. With tech, we have the company leaders prioritizing profits over safety of their users, and there is growing public outrage and a lot of activism going on. And the government hasn't really yet passed any meaningful regulatory laws, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Second, in both cases, there is an enormous amount of preventable harm going on. Engineers back then working on cars, just as engineers now, are kind of allowed to not take the necessary steps to prevent harm that we know is happening. And then third, like I mentioned earlier, the auto industry back then put a lot of work into marketing campaigns to shift the responsibility of safety onto the user. And this type of thing comes up so often, especially in my work, which is focused on designing for safety and against interpersonal harm, especially things like child abuse and domestic violence. People will say, you know, it's the user's responsibility to understand how this product works and even to understand how someone else might use it against them. People will say, like, if you're going to use a certain app or a piece of tech, you know, you should know that you're the product. If it's free, they're of course selling your data, doing all these things. And if you don't like that, you just shouldn't use that piece of tech, as if that's a realistic option in lots of cases. But anyway, it's a lot of responsibility to put on everyday people, especially people who might not have a high level of tech literacy. So this is a list of ways that people surviving domestic violence can stay safe online. It includes things like how to delete your browser history. There are checklists like this all over the internet. And I'm not saying that this is bad. It's really important that we have resources like this out there for people who are in a domestic violence context and need to stay safe, because tech is absolutely a part of domestic violence. But my question is sort of like, why is this the solution? Why are we putting all the responsibility on victims and survivors to do this work? Shouldn't we be tackling it at the root instead? And that's kind of what my work is all about, like fixing the digital side of these problems at the digital source. But right now it's sort of like, let's just put all the responsibility on the user, which is very much in line with what the auto industry was doing before 1968. And I want to point out quickly that this is a very intentional marketing tactic. This is something that people who run these big companies within tech are intentionally doing to shift blame and responsibility away from themselves and onto us as the end users. People will always say that you should actually read the legal agreements as if that's even possible, and that it's our job to understand how tech is being used. And this idea like didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere. It was a very intentional thing. And I think, you know, having studied now the history of the seatbelt and looking into other paradigm shifts, it seems that this is a tactic that's very common among powerful industries, and that it's something that throughout history people have tried to shift responsibility away from themselves and their companies and onto the end users for the harm that's happening in an effort to avoid regulation that might hurt their bottom line. Okay, fourth connection between pre-1968 auto industry and tech today is that there is basically no government oversight, and there's miserable failure at self-regulation. Tech right now, it basically gets to self-regulate itself, and I think we all know how well that's going. And then lastly, there's an element of organized activism as well as growing discontent from the general public. Public opinion is shifting away from big tech and becoming negative towards it. And there are lots of activists doing really good work at holding company leaders accountable, as well as educating people who don't work in tech about all of the awful things that are going on and kind of helping them to see all of the harm that's happening. This is the combination that led to politicians taking note of the auto industry in 1968 and starting to pass the first regulatory laws. And there are some really encouraging signs that the government is beginning to take notice in the tech industry today. So it's because of all this that I say that tech is in a pre-seatbelt phase. The seatbelts are there. There are a lot of us who really care and are working really hard to make sure that our products are ethical, which I think means that they are safe, just, and compassionate, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the fact is that a lot of our tech is still extremely harmful, even with individuals and teams who are really trying hard to sort of move the needle on this. And that's because we don't yet have laws mandating that we have to make these seatbelts of tech a regular part of our process and our product. And those who lead the industry's companies are continuing to just choose to prioritize profits over the tech equivalent of seatbelts, and they're totally allowed to do that. So, okay, with all this in mind, I want to take one more look at the sort of overall timeline of the paradigm shift of seatbelts, this time with some additional framing of what's going on with the public, which is the text that's at the bottom. I'll just give you a second to look at this before I sort of go through it. Okay, so I've broken this into 3 sections. The first one on the left is when there's a lot of harm going on. There's some activism, but the general public is kind of just indifferent or unaware about this problem that's happening. The second phase in the middle is when activism increases, public opinion shifts, and politicians start to take notice and draft new laws on the topic. And then the final stage is where the combination of activism as well as further laws that sort of clarify and add on to the first laws, as well as just general culture around the topic, all sort of coalesce into an actual behavior change among most people, which is what we see at the very end, where so many people are now willingly wearing seatbelts. So there are two sort of key insights from all this. The first one is that paradigm shifts are totally possible, but they require sustained effort over a long period of time. For seatbelts, it was a little over 30 years. And then the second insight is that a focus on specific goals is very important. So I want to say that Ralph Nader was not by any means the only activist working on the issue of auto safety, but his book is a really good sort of example of the specific goals that the activists back then had. The things like calibrating tire pressure for safety instead of comfort, making dashboard displays less shiny and light reflecting. It wasn't just like cars need to be safer. There were some very, very specific things that they had that they wanted to change. And they also had many proposed solutions. So now that we've talked about the paradigm shift, I want to get into what we say when we mean ethical tech, because if we want to contribute to the paradigm shift currently happening in tech from unethical to ethical, we need to understand what that actually means. So I think when we're talking about ethical tech, we usually mean something to do with tech products, but it can also have to do with the industry itself. And then I think that within each of these areas, there are three different issues, which are safety, justice, and compassion. I think that when we're talking about ethical tech and whatever the issue is, we can usually fit it into one of these three categories. And because one of the insights from studying the paradigm shift is that it's very important to be specific with what we're talking about and specific with our goals so that there can be actual accountability, instead of saying, tech needs to be more ethical, I want to spend a few minutes breaking down each and every one of these. And I am about to go through and tell you about every single issue with tech, like every single ethical issue and where it fits into these. So, and if you think of one or you know of one that isn't on this list, I'm sure there are things that I have missed, so definitely let me know. Okay, first off, tech products with safety issues. This includes things like tech that is used for stalking, technology facilitated domestic violence, which is where I mainly put my focus. Then there's image abuse, also known as revenge porn, although that's not really the best term because revenge actually isn't always part of it, and porn implies some level of consent. There's invasive surveillance. So this is often of domestic partners, children, elders, and also workers is becoming a really big thing, especially low-wage workers being invasively surveilled. Cyberbullying through text or social media or other different platforms. And then anonymous harassment, such as like what we see on Twitter and similar platforms, and doxing of people's personal identities and personal information. Next up is justice. Issues of justice within tech products include tech that harms the planet, like Bitcoin mining, although I read that maybe that's not as bad as it seems, but it still seems pretty bad. Data harms. So this includes things like what sort of data gets collected and about who and how it's used. For example, in Chicago, where I live, there's this really harmful thing called the gang database that the police use. There's very little transparency, and it includes names of all these people who are not actually affiliated or have anything to do with gangs, yet they don't really have any recourse to getting their names off of this database. Then there's racist, sexist algorithms or algorithms that are otherwise oppressive. So this is things like predictive policing algorithms that way a Black man is more likely to commit a crime than a white man with the same history and background. Exploitative design practices. So this is things like bringing in end users to help create solutions to problems that are then packaged up nicely and sold back to those users without them getting any sort of input in how the final product is actually used or what it does, and not getting any say in the funds from the project for their knowledge and ideas. And this is especially harmful when it's something that is meant for a group that is already somewhat exploited. Then there are social good projects that do more harm than good, which we see a lot in terms of designers and technologists going into sort of poor spaces or third world countries and aiming to do some type of social good project that actually doesn't do a lot of good and can even be harmful, especially when people leave before understanding the full impacts of the project. And then finally, harmful disruption that has a really serious cost. So this is things like Airbnb making cities unlivably expensive. Lastly, there's issues of compassion in tech products. So this is cruelty in advertising and promotion, such as showing a woman who has had a miscarriage, advertisements for diapers, hurtful copy. A good example of this is Twitter's original message when you went over the character count limit. Their original thing was something along the lines of like, you need to think of something more clever. And that was maybe funny to some people, but to a lot of people, if you weren't in the right headspace, that was just kind of hurtful and mean. Failing to design for stress cases. So really quickly, Eric Meyer and Sarah Washer-Betcher's book, Design for Real Life, is a really good book about compassionate and inclusive tech. And it includes this idea of stress cases, which is the idea that Home Depot might be designing for users who are really excited to be there because they're working on a really fun like kitchen remodel. But actually there are lots of users there who are in a situation like my fridge has just broke. I'm about to lose a lot of food. I don't have a lot of money and time, and I need to get this figured out really quickly, and I'm really stressed out about it. And those people often get left behind when we're designing. Then there's issues of re-traumatizing users. This is often in the form of not giving people proper consent to things that they are being opted into, not being clear about what's happening. Even things like showing the related articles at the bottom of an article you read will have headlines that can be really intense that you don't want to see, but you didn't have any choice over that. And this gets into the next one, disallowing control over what is seen. So a good example of this also comes from the book Design for Real Life, where Eric Meyer talks about how he tragically lost his young daughter, and Facebook continued to show reminders about things like that it was her birthday coming up, even after she had died. And there was no way that he was able to make this stop happening. And then there's the final issue I was able to find in terms of compassion, which is secretly experimenting with users' emotions. This is also something that Facebook did, people might remember in, I believe, 2014, where they were removing all of the happy content from people's feeds and leaving only the sad content. And then they studied if that affected what those users ended up posting themselves. And they found that, yeah, if you only show people sad things, what they post will get more sad because they are now more sad. And they are just kind of doing these types of experiments without getting any type of consent from people. Okay, moving on. Issues within the tech industry. Safety, I'm going to get into safety ones first. So this includes issues of workplace harassment, assaults, and abuse. Next up is HR teams who protect the company over people, especially victims of the different things in that first category. And then unsafe working conditions. And this is things like what we see in Amazon warehouses, where there's regular documentation of all sorts of really intense safety issues, things like overheated spaces that don't have air conditioning and people like passing out as they attempt to keep working. And then there's the story of a woman who was denied lighter duties once she was in her second or third trimester of pregnancy, and she just wanted to be able to not lift heavy things, which is what pretty much all doctors agree is very important when you're pregnant. She was denied that accommodation, and then she had a late-term miscarriage and lost her baby. Then there are issues of justice in the tech industry. These include things like inequitable hiring, retention, and promotion, which leads to certain groups who already have more power having an easier time getting hired, retained, and promoted. Toxic and exploitative cultures, unjust worker compensation, which again, we're really seeing, especially at places like Amazon, where certain employees who are deemed more valuable get a much bigger share of the enormous profits than others, as well as the contractors who work at Google are often paid much less than their counterparts who are full-time employees. Poor or no healthcare, failing employees with accessibility needs, which we're really seeing right now as so many companies are arbitrarily chose September, October to open their offices back up and are forcing people to go back into the offices even after they've proven for over a year that they absolutely can support people working remotely. And then things like science and computer science departments in education that are reproducing existing oppression. So things like CS students or people in different STEM industries, women are getting harassed or even assaulted at a rate that pushes them out of STEM before they can even actually enter the industry. And then there's issues of compassion. There's probably more on this list, but the issues I was able to identify include lack of agency, which leads to worker burnout, which we're seeing in really huge numbers right now, especially with the pandemic, as people aren't really given any type of space to get support or kind of process what's happening and are just expected to continue as normal. And then just this sort of generally failing to see human beings before seeing employees and just kind of viewing people as cogs in your capitalist machine as opposed to human beings. Okay, so that was a lot. Here's the list of all of the topics that I just went through. I'm betting that a lot of people who are attending this talk today are already taking some type of meaningful action in one of these, or are learning about it, or are at least very interested in at least one, if not more, of these topics. So I want you to just take a few seconds to think about your topic. Then think about, where does it fall in this sort of general timeline of a paradigm shift? Is it still in the research phase where we're sort of still just kind of learning about it and doing studies on what it actually is and its impacts? Are we in an education phase where we've kind of done this research and now the greater public needs to be educated? Have there been laws passed that sort of need to be clarified with additional laws? Or is real change starting to happen? And it's an issue of sort of filtering out all these different parts of the paradigm shift and coalescing them into actual behavior change. I think it might help at this point to look at a specific example from the list that's a little more relevant and timely than the seatbelt example. So really quickly, we're going to look at the issue of racist algorithms. So the earliest place where I could find in researching this topic any issue of bias or racist algorithms comes from back in 1986 from a medical school called St. George's in the UK. A doctor there created an algorithm to help with admissions, and his goal was actually to weed out human bias and to make everything more fair in terms of their admissions. But after a few years, the staff kind of looked around and were very concerned with how little diversity there was among the successful applicants. So they had an inquiry where they looked into the algorithm and they found all sorts of different issues. For example, the process of giving and taking away points to a candidate weighed things like the applicant's name. And if it was sort of non-European sounding, that applicant would get docked 15 points. The algorithm also designated candidates either Caucasian or non-Caucasian based on their name and their place of birth, and then would give points to Caucasian people and take away points from people that it deemed non-Caucasian. Those were some of the big issues. There were some other ones, but the school was actually found guilty of discrimination, but they didn't really face any actual consequences. It wasn't until 2016, which is 30 years later, that there was a lot of activism in the issue that sort of started to break through and get into the sort of mainstream non-tech, non-activist, non-academic space. And I think that where that happened was in 2016 with this ProPublica article. They demonstrated that criminal prediction algorithms were racist against Black people. And there had definitely been articles and other warnings about this in the time in between these two events. There were some very meaningful studies in the 2000s, but I think this is where the sort of average person who doesn't work in tech started to be exposed to this concept of biased algorithms. So then it was 2 years later in 2018 that Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru published their paper demonstrating that Amazon's facial recognition has a far higher error rate for dark-skinned women than light-skinned men. And that brings us to where we are now in 2021. In May of this year, the Algorithmic Justice and Online Platform Transparency Act was introduced into Congress. It has not been passed yet. It is in a committee, but this law is actually really good, and activists are overall very happy with it. So this is very exciting because we might be getting our first law in this topic. Next up will come bills being passed, followed by real change happening as behaviors start to change. But I once again want people to take note that it's been over 30 years since the issue was actually identified to the present day, where there's a fair amount of momentum happening, and we might actually be getting our first law to fix the problem. But also I want to point something out, that as progress begins to really take form, this is where opposition really increases. Opposition gets a lot fiercer around this point. So first off, Timnit Gebru was fired from Google for trying to raise awareness on this issue, basically just doing her job, but doing it in a way that they didn't really like. We can expect to see a lot of different companies kind of pushing back from having to make substantive change to their ways of working. There's currently a group backed by the companies Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Twitter that are kind of against this algorithmic justice bill. Their sort of argument is that making algorithms more transparent will open a bunch of roadmaps for hackers, Russian trolls, and conspiracy theorists, which I think is a pretty flimsy argument. But they also say that actually what we should be doing to help these problems that biased algorithms are perpetuating is expanding our civil liberties in other ways, such as housing, employment, and credit, which, like, yeah, we should totally be doing all those things, but doing all those things doesn't mean that we don't have to also hold them accountable to making their algorithms transparent and just. And I think we can definitely expect even more pushback as things continue to progress from company leaders who don't want to change their very lucrative ways of working, even if it means their tech is going to be just a little bit safer. Okay, so we've talked about paradigm shifts. We've talked about what ethical tech means, and we've kind of looked at an issue of ethical tech in the paradigm shift sort of timeline and model. So next up, we can finally talk about the whole title of this talk, which is contributing to the paradigm shift and plugging into it. There are a couple of key things that I think are really important when we're thinking about how we as individuals, or contributing with a group of other individuals, can push the paradigm shift forward and speed along this transition into an actual ethical tech industry. So first off is choosing just one issue. I think just there are so many different issues, going back to that slide that listed out all of the different problems, and even just trying to tackle one, it's going to be really tough and can lead to being overwhelmed and burnt out. But if you try to choose more than one issue to tackle, I think that's just going to happen even faster. It's just going to be even more of a problem. So I think choosing one to focus on is important. Definitely signal boosting the other ones, but focusing your efforts on one. Next, plugging into existing activism. There are a lot of groups doing really amazing work on most of these issues, and they need more people to help carry out their mission. It's important to remember that there's almost always something already happening, and that we don't want to start a new thing ourselves unless it's actually necessary. And sometimes it might be, like, there might not actually be a group that's currently working. There are some groups that get started with a lot of momentum and then they kind of peter out, but they still have a website. So trying to figure out, like, if they're actually active and you can do anything can be a little tricky, and you might have to start your own thing, but a lot of times you don't. And it's really important that we don't center ourselves in this effort, because the goal is not to center ourselves and make a name for ourselves. It's to push ethical tech forward. And then next is, it's really important to follow the lead of the impacted community, and that's also going to help get you further. Sasha Kostantichuk, who wrote Design Justice, which is a really amazing book that I really highly suggest to designers, but also just people who work in tech. They say that wherever there is oppression, there are people resisting oppression. there are always people who are already working on these issues, and it's really important to find them and elevate their voices. And then think about the paradigm shift timeline to inform your area of work. So what do you actually need to do? Is it research? Do we need to just understand what this problem is? Do we need to educate our fellow technologists as well as everyday people? And so my issue is technology facilitated domestic violence, and we're definitely in the sort of still in the research phase in a lot of ways, but there has been a lot of research over the last decade or so. And I'm trying to contribute to it in an educational way by doing talks and writing my book. There might be laws that need to be passed if education has already happened and people are sort of already aware. But I want to point out that laws are never ahead of the curve. They're always the cap on many years of activism. And a lot of times we kind of want to jump to like, well, we need a law around this. Like, how can we make this a legal thing? Which is very normal way to think about it, because that's how we see the sort of like end goal. But usually there's often a lot of other stuff that actually happens to get to that law. Ideally, politicians would be much more proactive about this stuff. But the reality is that until public opinion starts to change and sort of turn against something, they're very unlikely to act. And then we can expect resistance. Whenever activism ramps up and there are some actual tangible, even if they're small wins, that's when the opposition gets a lot more organized. And they're going to be well-funded and have a lot of connections. So it's important to expect backlash from well-funded company leaders who are aiming to protect the status quo and very, very much want things to stay the way they are. And then I want to just have a quick note about checkbox frameworks and action bias. I think it's really important that we take action on the issues that we care about, but it's also really important that we do deep learning on our topic and that we don't ignore that part. So a checkbox framework is basically a list of items that you can consider and then you can check off. So you can say, like, if you're designing something and you want to make sure that it's inclusive, you can say like, oh yes, we've considered bias, we have considered interpersonal harm, we've done all the things, we're good. And that's very attractive, but a checkbox framework means that we run the risk of just sort of taking those actions and prioritizing those actions and not actually doing the deep learning and internalizing of that problem. Checkbox frameworks don't take unique factors about the problem into consideration. I've been asked to make a checkbox framework or like a list of things to think about for designing against domestic violence. And I've really pushed back on that because I think any type of checkbox you make is going to be an oversimplification. And I don't think that I could ever actually capture everything that needs to be considered for every different technical issue with technology facilitate domestic violence, because there's financial products, there's issues with shared accounts, there's Internet of Things harms, and there's just no way that you can actually like get at all of those different things. People need to be thinking about it within their own context and their own unique product, which a checkbox framework is never going to be able to do. They can also make us feel overly secure that we've done all the things, even when we haven't. And they're an outshoot of action bias, which is a tendency to favor action over inaction and to respond with action as the default, even when we don't have a solid rationale to support that action. Action bias happens when we're incapable of living with discomfort when presented with difficult topics. And pretty much all of the different things that I've covered that were on that giant list of issues in ethical tech are going to involve some very heavy, difficult things that it's really important that we sit with and we internalize. Action bias causes us to jump towards solutioning before we fully understand and internalize those problems, and can cause us to stop learning when we only have a shallow understanding of the issue, especially in terms of things like generational, societal, and systems level factors. So I'm not saying that you need to be an expert in whatever it is that you want to take action on, like definitely not. But I do think that you should kind of resist checkbox frameworks and action bias, and that as you are starting to take action and starting to plug into work, that you are also deepening your learning as you go. I think some people have the sort of like opposite effect where they feel like they need to learn everything possible and be able to speak on it perfectly before they're able to take any action. And that's like sort of also an issue. I think that there can definitely be a happy balance between taking action and also deepening your learning as you're taking that action. But it's very important to do both. Okay, last couple minutes here, I just have a few pieces of advice for anyone who is currently already doing this type of work or wants to start. So the first is to stay hopeful. Remember that change is absolutely possible. There are so many examples of paradigm shifts throughout history. We totally know that they can happen, despite what the opposition wants us to think. But at the same time, we need to be realistic. The paradigm shifts that I talked about took over 30 years to really gain traction. And I definitely don't think that that timeline is a given, especially just how much quicker we can organize with each other and sort of disseminate information. We don't have to think that it's going to always be multiple decades, but it is definitely going to be multiple years, and it's not going to happen overnight. So remember that the paradigm shifts are possible, but it's sustained effort over a long period of time to make them happen. So with that in mind, I think it's really important to find your people, to find an organization or a group that is working on this issue, to find other people at your workplace who maybe want to enact some type of change, to find a Slack group or a Discord. There's lots of those out there of people who have similar politics around certain issues and are trying to move the needle on them. Even a Twitter hashtag can help, but whatever it is, find your people, because nothing great happens alone. And without a team for solidarity and support when the going gets tough, it's much, much harder to stay motivated and hopeful and to continue to do the work. And then I think we should all take a nap. This is a great idea for everyone, but I especially think it's important for people doing meaningful work. This is really about setting a sustainable pace. Take breaks, remember that the work will take years, and be realistic about how much you can actually do. Like maybe you can join an organization and start putting a ton of hours into it, but a lot of us can't do that. But maybe you can volunteer a few hours. Maybe you actually don't have the capacity to volunteer at all, but you can donate $10 a month to a few different organizations. Whatever it is, find your sustainable pace. And then really though, do take a nap, because it's important to remember that the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and the Jeff Bezoses of the world are counting on us to be too tired and exhausted and overwhelmed and sad and heartbroken about all of the different setbacks that we experience as we try to make meaningful change. And they're really counting on us to give up. So take a nap and be ready to come back and work on your issue. And I'm just like, I'm very sick of activists and different people who really care about topics sort of being pressured to sacrifice their entire lives. I don't think we should sacrifice our lives. I don't think we should sacrifice time with our family or things that we love. I think we deserve to be happy and well rested, and that we can do all of those things while also putting in valuable, meaningful time into whatever the issue is that you want to work on. And then I want just to encourage people to sort of push back against the empty rhetoric of ethical tech, to remember that this is often a marketing tactic, and to call it out when you see that. And then with individuals, be kinder than you are with companies who I think totally deserve to be called out when it's purely marketing. But ask people, like, what is the specific problem that you're trying to solve? Like, what are the actual solutions that you're going for? And then hold our company leaders accountable to defining actual problems and making progress on actual solutions, instead of just talking about the need for something more ethical. These are a few resources that I really like. I've already talked about Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock, such a great book. Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Murray Brown is sort of more about activism in general, less in the tech space, but still really important. And then if you're interested, I still feel weird about hyping my own book, but there's Design for Safety, which I wrote, and I think it pairs nicely with these other two books, Design for Real Life, which is all about inclusive and compassionate tech, as well as Design for Cognitive Bias, which gets at issues of cognitive bias, such as racism. And these are all from a book apart. And then lastly, there's this really amazing workshop that I did a few months ago that has like totally changed my life. It's great for, I think, everyone in tech, but especially designers. This is where I learned about action bias and checkbox frameworks. And I learned a lot of other things about how white supremacy shows up in my own work as a designer, as well as just like my personal life. It's from the Creative Action Lab, and they are hosting this workshop pretty regularly. So you can check on their website, Creative Reaction Lab.com to see if there are upcoming sessions scheduled, which I believe right now there are. Okay, and then I want to close with this quote from Arthur Ashe, who was a groundbreaking tennis star and social activist. He said, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." Maybe your thing right now is just changing one aspect of how your team does its work. Maybe there's one thing about your company that you want to get a few like-minded coworkers together to try to push for some type of change with. Maybe you can plug into a group, or maybe you can donate $5 a month to a good organization. But whatever it is that you can do, it is going to help. So even if you can't do something huge, that's totally fine. I think it's really important to start where you are with this work. Thanks. That's my talk. Again, my name is Eva PenzeyMoog. My book is Designed for Safety. My contact information is there if you want to get in touch, eva@athlight.com, and I'm on Twitter @ePenzeyMoog.